Inside of adjustments, most of these are pretty straightforward. Like most of these are things that are very parallel to the color options that are down here, but rather than creating a color adjustment layer like this, it applies it to a single layer without having it working like this. So it makes it so it's destructive photo editing. It's actually affecting the picture itself rather than being something you can turn on and off, which isn't ideal. But let's just look at some of the options. Hey, it's brightness and contrast. You know what? I'm not going to go through all these options. I'm just going to brightness and contrast. We know brightness and contrast. Levels, it's basically a dumbed down version of curves, just as brightness and contrast is a very dumbed down version of curves. Just as curves has RGB, so does this. I'm not going to dip into levels too much because we know curves already, and that's so much better. I mean, a lot of these, like the way that they're playing with color is all, from my perspective, like we've learned curves, so we don't need to worry about those. But I mean, if you want to play with some options that, you know, are simpler, it's only a couple of sliders, feel free. These just aren't as good. So some of these we've used, like hue saturation, we use like just to select out a certain area and say change the color of a t-shirt or a specific area. Color balance, this was great to kind of, if we have a image that's slightly off and we want to change the color, although this isn't the greatest way to go about this. It is technically a way that you could do it right there. Man, that worked really well, just right out of the box. I had not tested it that way before. Black and white, this is a much better way to make something black and white, just because it gives all of the different options right here. And again, we've covered this already. Photo filter, there's all of these things right here. Let me go back to this one. There's all of these options right here that, like, they just create a nice effect, and I can think of like 20 other ways to create this effect, but hey, this is a one-button solution out of the box, so cool, check that out. Channel mixer, this is actually a really interesting one. The reason that I haven't covered it and I don't deal with it too much is the way that I generally will go about mixing channels is copying and pasting the channels out and like playing with their opacities. There's some really cool things that can be done with channel mixers, but I don't want to get into it because it gets a little nitty-gritty. Don't worry about channel mixers. I swear, the use case on them is so rare that it's unnecessary. It really is unnecessary. I promise you, it's so rare that you use that. I've used it 3 times in 20 years of using Photoshop. That is honest. Color lookup. The big reason color lookup is here is if you're working with video, and these are called LUTs if you're working with video, and basically what you can do is you can have a color lookup table, and if you have a piece of footage, you can apply it to different pieces of footage, and they'll all have the same LUT on top of them. And this is a way to see that for a single image in Photoshop. So if you're not working with video, if you're not, doing things like that, you really don't need to worry about it. Sure, it creates cool looks is the other thing of it, but it's really about matching the video. Invert, we know it inverts things, although it's a lot more useful for things like masks. Posterize, I haven't covered posterize. I actually had to re-look up what posterize does because it's one of those things. It's like, why would I ever use this? Who's using this? I see it every so often. I'm like, why? What's the reason here? I'm sure there's some like crazy reason, but I don't know. Threshold is actually, when I was showing how to make custom brushes, using threshold could have been a simpler way to go about it rather than doing it directly with masks. But again, it's kind of like, really? There's a tool specifically for that? How often do you need that look? Gradient map, I feel the exact same way. Like, how often do you, it's a lot easier to just kind of put a couple of, this is such a confusing way to go about doing this. Like, yes, you can do this, but the use case for this is, I just don't know. Gradient maps, they exist, and if you want to use them, great. Maybe some people doing design things love gradient maps. You can see my opinion for a lot of these things. Selective color. Okay, so this is an interesting one. Look at the red ones. This is something that would be great, except for the fact that it's destructive, and the other way to go about doing it is making a selection and doing it on a different layer. I used to love selective color, but now that I know there's a way to like copy it onto another layer, do it that way, like sure, it's a couple of more steps, but I understand what's happening behind the system a little bit better. I can undo it. I can change it later. So while this is cool, like, oh, I want to make all of the greens a different color. Let's see what we can do right here. I can honestly say I use this so rarely. But, whatever, it's there. If you want to just adjust those colors in a way that's totally destructive, you can use selective color. Shadows and highlights. This is actually something that is useful. It's basic option. Let's look at the basic options first. This is at 0. It can pull out the details in the highlights and then in the shadows, and it can pull out the details in the highlights. So here's the before, here's the after, and that's actually pretty cool right there. And there's all sorts of other options for the radius and the tone and the way that you can play around with it that I'm not going to get into, but just at its very basic, shadow and highlight. Like if the darks are too dark and the lights are too light, shadow and highlight's pretty cool. Remember that it's also down here. Wait a second. Remember that it's not actually down here. So the only way to get to that is in image adjustment, shadow highlights. So that's a good thing to know. HDR toning is one of these things that you have to flatten the document to use, so you can imagine how often I use it. And it creates cool effects. Look at this surrealistic effect. It basically fakes what you could get through HDR by going to some of the different modes. And, it can make things look really cool. So here, let's go into this image and let's use our friend auto color, which we haven't talked about yet, auto contrast and auto tone to get this to a really good place. Yeah, that's all I'm going to say with those. Then let's go into HDR toning. This is a better image to kind of do these things with. And you can see that you can do all sorts of fun stuff, I guess. I don't know if this is your thing. Great. HDR toning does magical surrealistic colors, if that's what you're into. Desaturate is the exact same thing as going into hue saturation and pulling the saturation over all the way down. What I really like about the desaturate, what I thought was going to happen is it was going to give us a pop-up that was going to say, are you sure you want to use desaturate? Black and white is better. So if you're looking to get rid of all of the colors just like in one click, yeah, you can do desaturate. If you want to like make it black and white and actually look good, this is the way to do it with a few more options, just using black and white right there. So there's something to be aware of. Now, what match color does right here is it matches the color of one image to the color of another image. So you can load in an image and then try to make it so they have similar color profiles. I'll be honest, I've never had success with it. Feel free to play around with it. Maybe your results will be different than mine. I don't know. Like maybe I've just been using it wrong. I've never had match color work. Replace color. This is another one that I thought was really cool before I really knew how to use Photoshop all that well, because now I know how to make selections and do it this way. This is kind of in my opinion, a really strange way to go about doing things. It's like combining too many things into a single tool. Like I just don't have the ability. Like it's creating a mask inside of this tool that I can't adjust later. It's affecting too many things at once. I don't know. I have issues with this. But to each his own. Like, there's all sorts of things it's doing too many things at once. Like, yes, it's cool that I can do all of this, but I've shown you other better ways to do this replace color effect, making a selection and then adjusting it that way. And I suggest you stick with those, because then if you want to change it later, you can. And then equalize is, again, just kind of another way to automate color adjustment. That's just a black box with 0 options inside of it. So there's all sorts of exciting color adjustment things that I might or might not have gotten into earlier. Auto tone, auto contrast, auto color. They do what they say they do.